From 1770 to 1772, the British ignored the colonies and tension cooled substantially. However, in the fall of 1772, Lord North began preparations to pay royal governors out of customs revenue rather than let the colonial assemblies control payment. This would deny the assemblies the, quote, power of the purse, breaking assemblies' ability to effectively check royal power by withholding or threatening to withhold payment. In response to this threat, Samuel Adams urged every Massachusetts community to appoint a committee to coordinate colony-wide measures protecting colonial rights. Within the year, approximately 250 committees of correspondence formed throughout the colonies. These committees linked political leaders of almost every colony in resistance to the British. The committees of correspondence began on the community level in Massachusetts and eventually became the means by which the colonies coordinated their efforts to preserve their rights. The British East India Company suffered from the American boycott of British tea, as Americans smuggled in Dutch tea in place of their own. In an effort to save the company, Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773, which eliminated import tariffs on tea entering England and allowed the company to sell directly to consumers rather than through merchants. These changes lowered the prices of British tea to below that of smuggled tea, which the British hoped would end the boycott. Parliament planned to use the profits from tea sales to pay the salaries of the colonial royal governors, a move which, like the Townshend duties, particularly angered colonists. While protests of the Tea Act in the form of tea boycotts and the burning of tea cargoes occurred throughout the colonies, the response in Boston was most aggressive. In December 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans dumped about $70,000 worth of tea into Boston Harbor. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, took on an epic status. Parliament responded swiftly and angrily to the Tea Party with a string of legislation that came to be known as the Intolerable Acts, which punished innocent and guilty Bostonians alike. The Intolerable Acts included the four Coercive Acts of 1773 and the Quebec Act. The Coercive Acts are made up of the Boston Port Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the New Quartering Act. So the Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to all traffic until the East India Company and the Crown received payment for the tea and its duties. The Administration of Justice Act said that an official who killed a colonist while performing his duties could be tried in England, where he would receive sympathetic treatment, rather than in Massachusetts. It's also called the Murder Act and declared open season on colonists. The Massachusetts Government Act modified the colony's charter and stated the Crown would appoint members of the Governor's Council and limit the number of town meetings that could be held without the governor's prior approval. And finally, the New Quartering Act declared troops under the governor's command could be lodged in virtually any uninhabited building. In addition to the Coercive Acts, you have the Quebec Act. It was passed the same day, and it enlarged the boundaries of Quebec south of the Ohio River, providing for trial of civil cases without a jury, and recognized the Catholic Church, giving it the privileges it had under the French. It gave Canada jurisdiction over territory claimed by Virginia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and deprived settlers of hoped-for homesteads and speculators of hoped-for profits. Searching for an organized and coordinated response to the Intolerable Act, all of the colonies except for Georgia sent delegates to a meeting at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 26, 1774. With 55 delegates present, each colony in the First Continental Congress had one vote regardless of size. They passed the Suffolk Resolves, denouncing the Coercive Acts as unconstitutional, advised people to arm, and called for economic sanctions against Britain. It also created the Continental Association to organize and enforce sanctions against the British, and issued the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, summarizing their position. The First Continental Congress criticized all revenue measures passed since the end of the French and Indian War. They denounced the dissolution of colonial assemblies and the keeping of troops in the colonies during peacetime. Congress also defined the colonists' rights to include life, liberty, and property, and stated that colonial legislatures had exclusive powers to make laws and pass taxes, subject only to royal veto. About the only concession it made was to pledge that Americans would cheerfully consent to trade regulations for the good of the empire. Yet there were factions within the Continental Congress. While most were unwilling to take up arms just yet, there were some who favored strong measures, like Sam Adams, John Adams, and Patrick Henry. As Congress's proceedings came to an end, some delegates began to tinker with its recommendations to protect their own colonies' interests. Members from the Chesapeake colonies wanted to ensure that if the non-exportation policy had to go into effect in 1775, it would not begin until that year's tobacco crop had been shipped. Carolina delegates went so far as to threaten to walk out of the meeting if rice was not exempted from the non-exportation agreement. Northern delegates agreed to the Carolinians' demands, but the incident demonstrated how fragile colonial unity was. Two final tasks remained. First, Congress needed an enforcement mechanism to ensure that its agreed-upon measures were followed. It created the Continental Association, a mutual pledge by the delegates to see that their colonies ceased importing any British goods after December 1, 1774, and if the dispute with Britain was not resolved by September 1775, make sure that their provinces ceased exporting goods to Britain and the West Indies. Voters in every town were to choose committees to enforce the terms of the association. The approximately 7,000 men who served on these committees in the winter of 1774 to 1775 formed grassroots radical governments. Second, Congress sent a document to the king and the British and the colonists, letting them know they no longer considered Parliament to be a legitimate legislature over the colonies. Delegates asked King George III to use his royal authority and interposition to protect his loyal subjects in America. So long as the king protected colonial rights, he could count on the Americans' allegiance. Hardly anyone called for independence at this point, but many had moved far from the positions they had taken at the start of the French and Indian Wars. But not all colonists accepted such drastic reinterpretations of the imperial connection. Even if they regarded recent parliamentary measures as threats to American liberty, some colonists continued to recognize parliamentary authority over the colonies. By late 1774, however, it became more dangerous to express such notions. The local committees not only enforced the boycott against British goods, but also intimidated their opponents into silence. A new political order emerged, requiring colonists to choose one side or the other in an atmosphere of increasing polarization. The advocates of colonial rights began to call themselves Whigs and condemned their opponents as Tories. These labels dated from the late 17th century when the Tories had supported the accession of Catholic King James II, and the Whigs had opposed it. Colonial Whigs used this label to identify themselves as champions of liberty and called their opponents Tories to represent them as defenders of tyrannical royal government. As imperial ties proceeded to unravel, there appeared to be no third option. Years of political turmoil inspired colonists to think more systematically about their rights than they had ever done before. As they did so, members of the elite and laborers, men and women, black colonists and white, were all drawn into the politics of resistance. They read and sometimes wrote letters and pamphlets, marched in the streets, boycotted tea, and wore homespun clothing. In doing so, they came to recognize their common interest as Americans and their differences from the British. They became aware, as Benjamin Franklin would later write, of the need to break through the bounds in which a dependent people had been accustomed to think and act, so that they might properly comprehend the character they had assumed. In the winter of 1774 to 1775, however, the character of the Americans was not yet fully revealed. Although they had achieved an unprecedented level of unity in their opposition to Parliament, they did not all agree on where the path of resistance would lead. Americans had surely rebelled, but had not yet launched a revolution. In 1774, British Parliament held elections, but followers of Lord North won easily, and only a few members of Parliament urged their fellow legislators to adopt conciliatory measures before it was too late. Lord North ordered Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in America and newly installed Governor of Massachusetts, to destroy an arms stockpile in Concord, Massachusetts, and to arrest the radical leaders John Hancock and Sam Adams. North then introduced a measure that prohibited New Englanders from trading outside the British Empire or sending their ships to the North Atlantic fishing grounds. Both houses of Parliament followed a similar hard line by declaring the colony of Massachusetts to be in rebellion. At the same time, Lord North introduced a conciliatory proposition whereby Parliament pledged not to tax the colonies if their assemblies would voluntarily contribute to the defense of the empire and the costs of the civil government and the judiciary in their own colonies. British officials, however, would decide what was a sufficient contribution, a provision that protected Parliament's claim to sovereignty, and could use force against the colonies that did not pay their share. At one time, colonists might have found the conciliatory proposition acceptable. By the spring of 1775, it was too late. Colonists everywhere waited to hear what Britain's next move would be. But those in Massachusetts were most apprehensive. General Gage had begun fortifying Boston and had dissolved the Massachusetts legislature. The delegates assembled anyway, calling themselves the Provincial Congress. In October 1774, this body appointed an emergency executive body, the Committee of Safety, headed by John Hancock, to gather arms and ammunition and to organize militia volunteers. Some localities had already formed special companies of Minutemen who were ready at a minute's warning in case of an alarm. Massachusetts had, in effect, created a revolutionary government. King George had declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion in February 1775, and the British garrison received orders to seize the rebels' weapons and arrest their leaders, leading to the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. The Patriots assembled a militia, 15,000 strong, and laid siege to Boston, occupied by 6,500 British soldiers. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on June 14, 1775. The Congress was divided on the best course of action. They authorized formation of the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief, and produced the Olive Branch Petition, in which they attempted to come to an accord with King George. The king, however, issued a proclamation of rebellion, which declared that the states were in rebellion and the members of Congress were traitors. In conclusion, the period from 1770 to 1775 marked a pivotal shift in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. A combination of British missteps, such as the imposition of the Coercive Acts following the Boston Tea Party, and colonial responses through increasingly organized resistance and radicalized political ideas, set the stage for armed conflict. Events like the Boston Massacre, the establishment of the Continental Congress, and the mobilization of colonial militias in response to British military presence highlight the intensification of colonial opposition. Ultimately, this period's growing tensions and breakdown of imperial authority laid the foundations for the outbreak of the Revolutionary War in 1775, reshaping the destiny of both Britain and its rebellious colonies.